Welcome back to the MERN Stack series. Today we're going to be using ExpressRouter to refactor our code and essentially giving our entire codebase a complete makeover. In the last video, we were introduced to middlewares and we used them to modularize our code, and we broke down our authentication logic into this function, and then we used the request response cycle to ensure that every time a user tries to send a request on this endpoint, they have to go through the auth middleware first. Now, although we did do some refactoring in the last video, our existing code is still a bunch of endpoints inside our server.js file. Although it does work and it's fully functional, it's starting to get crowded. And maintaining this entire code base can become a bit of a challenge. If our application ends up having hundreds of endpoints, looking for one particular endpoint or trying to update it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. So today's objective is going to be sort of to get our entire code base more sleeker and organized. Now, given the problem that I just described, logically speaking, the best solution would be to group our routes according to some kind of categorization. Here, we can group the routes according to user routes such as sign up and login, and then we can also create a separate grouping for the routes related to post creation, deletion, updating, etc. To solve this problem, Express provides the router, which is a way to group our related routes together. Imagine Express routers as sort of like GPS for our code. They help us navigate through different parts of our application. So to create our first React router, let's go ahead and cut out these two routes from our server.js because these are both related to users login and sign up. Inside our main folder, we'll create a new folder for routes. Let's create a new file inside here called userroutes.js, and this is going to be our very first React router file. So we can go ahead and paste these into our user routes. And in here, I want you to type in const router equals express.router. To call this function, we must first import express as well into the file. So let's just type in express equals, and then we can just require the express package as well. We are going to need to export this from this file as well. So we can just do module.exports equals router. Now we must associate these endpoints with our router. So instead of app, we'll actually put in router.post and router.post over here as well. So everything you can do with app, such as app.put, app.delete, or other endpoints, we can also do the same thing with the router. Now that we have this setup complete, we can simply import this router in our server.js file. So back in server.js, let's type in const user router equals, and then we can just require from the routes folder, and we just have one file there, which is user routes. Okay, so this is going to be our user router. To use this router, we still need to define one common base URL for all of these endpoints. And as you can see, the API/users is common in both of these endpoints. So let's take that out of this part of the endpoints. And back in server.js, we're going to type in app.use, and then for this endpoint /API/users, we want to use the user route. Okay, so what this is telling our application is basically that if any request comes to an endpoint which begins with this base URL, we're going to redirect it to the user router. And what that will do is essentially go over into this file, and then it's going to look up these endpoints. So that would be /API/users/signup, and this would be /API/users/login. We can do the same thing with the posts route. So let's just copy this out and create a new router here. That would be post routes.js. And we can just paste this here. For the first two lines, we can just copy these lines back in here. Change the app to router. And then, of course, don't forget to export the router at the bottom of the file. And then we can use it inside our server.js by typing in our post router will be equal to require /routes and post routes. And then similarly, we're just going to say app.use slash API slash posts. So for any base URL, which would be API for the base URL API slash posts, we're going to have the post router. And then inside post routes, of course, we want to remove this part because we already defined that. So we're just going to backspace this. As you might have noticed, some imports are missing from these files. If you go over into server.js, you'll actually see some unused imports, which are being highlighted by VS Code. So we can just copy these, or let's just cut them out and paste them into the relevant file. Over here, we need access to the user model. So we're using the user model, and so we're importing it here. Similarly, in post routes, we're going to use the post model. So let's just cut that out and paste it inside post routes. Use these two inside our user routes because we need to use the bcrypt and the JWT. Lastly, we'll also need to use our auth middleware inside our post routes. So we're going to put that in there as well. And we also need to update the paths of some of these. So when we're inside user routes, this path is not valid anymore. We need to type in dot dot slash to go out of this routes folder, and then we can actually go into our models and then select the post. Same thing for middleware, so we can just add a dot here and then this should work. The same thing for user routes. We want to add a dot dot here so that we can actually leave the routes folder and then go into the models folder. And that should be all. I think we've got it all done. Let's just test these to make sure that they're working fully. Testing these routes will be super easy using Thunder Client. We'll just close our server, start it again, go over into Thunder Client. In our collections, we're just going to go over into the sign up request one. Let's just change this username just so that we can have something unique. User is created successfully. Let's try the login one. The token is being returned, and for the create post as well. Okay, so there's an error. It says the JWT is expired, so we could just use the fresh JWT and put it inside our create post, inside our headers, and then this should work as well. There we go, posted successfully. All right, so we've successfully refactored our code using ExpressRouter. The last thing I'm going to show you are controllers, which aren't specific to Express or Node.js, but they're a good coding practice and they're just going to clean up this code even further. So we're going to take these arrow functions that we created here and define them in their own file. Let's go over into our main folder, create a new folder for controllers. And in here, we're going to have, just like our router, we're going to have a post controller.js, and we're also going to have a user controller.js, and these are going to include the functions that we're using inside our routes. So inside our routes, let's define this function inside our controller. So let's just leave that hanging for now. We're going to go over into our post controller, exports dot, and now let's create a function called create post, and we can just paste in our function right here. This is basically creating a named export of create post from this file. And we will need to require the post model here. So let's just go over here and cut this out. Put this in here. And now we can just use this export inside post routes. So let's just type in const post controller is going to be equal to, and then we're going to require our controller from here. And now from this post controller, we can access that function that we made as a named import. So that would be post controller dot create post. And now you can see just how clean and organized this file has become. Let's do the same thing for our user controller. So we're going to copy out this function right here, this function, cut that out, and we're going to put it inside our user controller. This is going to look similar to this. So we're going to have a named export. Let's do exports dot signup, and that would be equal to this signup function that we have, login function, cut that out, put it into our controller, exports dot login would be equal to this function. And of course, we do need to include these imports in there now. Put that inside our controller. And finally, we can use this inside our user routes by simply typing in user controller equals require dot slash controllers slash user controller. Sorry, that's user controller. And now we can just type in user controller dot sign up and user controller dot login. Now, as the number of endpoints increases, our code base is going to look really sleek and organized with all of this refactoring. One interesting thing to note is that we can clearly see the sequence of middlewares inside such refactored code. For instance, we can clearly see that first the control is transferred to the auth middleware and then to the create post function inside the post controller. Similarly, we're going to have routes in which we have a series of middlewares working together in a pipeline. And in this case, it's going to be really easy to visualize that and understand exactly where all of these things are coming from. Additionally, if there's an error inside this function or inside this function, it's going to be much easier to debug and fix that error. That is all for today. We looked into how the Express router allows us to refactor and modularize our code, and we turned our server.js file into this much cleaner and more organized piece of code. And now we have a complete organized code base by our side to help us continue developing our MERN application and create that social media platform that we've been talking about. So stay tuned and happy coding.